Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the host of your LinkedIn speaker series, Rochelle Diamond.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rochelle Diamond. I'm on our employee experience team, and I run our speaker series. So excited to welcome you all here for our first speaker series in San Francisco. Yeah! Very exciting. As you may know, the LinkedIn Speaker Series is all about bringing inspiring ideas and innovative thinkers to make our members and our employees more productive and successful. And I always like to remind you that you can find all the amazing past inspiration we've had at speakers.linkedin.com, and we also have an iTunes channel where you can download the podcast. So on to our event for today. Very excited to welcome Brad Stone. We're actually welcoming him back to LinkedIn. A few years ago when he wrote his book, The Everything Store, about Jeff Bezos, he was here. You can check that out on speakers.linkedin.com. But now he's written a book called The Upstarts, and it's all about Airbnb and Uber and the companies that are literally changing the world that we live in. They're really fascinating stories about how both the companies started, challenges they've had along the way, challenges they may still have, and just pivotal moments for both of the companies. And it's really some fascinating stories. And we're very lucky today to have Shannon Stubo, our CMO, who will have a fireside chat with Brad and learn more about what he's discovered. So you can share content from the speaker series. Our hashtag for the speaker series is InSpeaker, and Brad is at Brad Stone. And without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Brad Stone and Shannon Stubo.
Thank you, Rochelle. So this is very fun for me. I've known Brad since 1999 when he worked at Newsweek magazine. Has anyone ever heard of Newsweek? It's gone now, right?
But I feel like I have to write a book to see you these days. Like,
I know, sorry. And I worked at Yahoo, and so he was a cub reporter covering Yahoo back then. So we've known each other literally that long. So I've sat through Brad asking my executives really difficult questions for the last number of years, and so this is my turn to give you a bunch of gotchas. So we're really excited.
Thank you guys for coming out today.
So we have a little tradition here. If we looked at your LinkedIn profile and read everything on there, there's something on there that we wouldn't know about you. We want to know what that is.
Okay. Well, you might, I don't know if you know this or not, but
You'll have to come up with a new one if I do.
Okay, my first job was actually in publicity. Did you know that?
No.
Yes, so when I graduated from Columbia in New York City, 1993, it feels like a long time ago.
Was anyone
now.
here born in 1993? Look, you got a whole bunch of them here. When he was graduating from Columbia, this is awesome.
This will be hard to understand, but I desperately wanted to work at Newsweek. It was the magazine I collected as a kid, and read every week. And it was actually the job that was open at the time. So I spent my first 2 years basically promoting the magazine's scoops. And I would have to come in. We printed on Saturday, so I would come in at like 5:30 a.m. on Sunday morning to go and fax. This is like really dating me right now, but fax the stories and the press releases to like CNN and other news outlets. So,
and a fax was like pretty innovative back then too, right?
Because
it used to be you had to call.
Bleeding edge technology. Well, the call was the follow-up. So I did the fax.
Did you get my fax?
I did the fax and then I did the follow-up. And it just gave me an appreciation, I think, for how the sort of media ecosystem operates. And I did that for a year and a half, and then I got a job as a researcher at Newsweek. So
here you are.
I left that off the LinkedIn profile.
So why? I was just about to ask you.
Because then I established a career in journalism, so it felt a little bit irrelevant to the later progression of things, but I've kind of come to grips with it and come to terms with it, and
so now we all know. I love it.
I think it was a good place to start because now I have a sort of understanding for how stories propagate throughout the media ecosystem. It's not natural. It's not organic. Oftentimes, it's the labors of people behind the scenes who are going and working to make sure that people know what other news outlets are reporting.
All the PR people in the room were super happy that you just said that, so thank you for that. So before we talk about how you made the switch from publicity to journalism, I'd love to know how you made the switch from journalism to being an author, a book author, a best-selling book author.
Thank you, Shannon. What a good question.
Thank you. I swear we didn't practice this either.
Well, I wrote a book in 2003 about robots. I don't know if you remember that. My parents did not even buy it. It was basically a washout. What do you think of the book, Dad? Oh, uncomfortable silence. And so it took me a couple years to recover from the ignominy of that experience. That book was called Gearheads. You can buy it now for, I think, 53 cents in the used marketplace of Amazon. In fact, I ran out of books once, and so I bought a used copy. And it came back to me, and I opened it up and had my signature, an inscription to somebody else on it. So I right away experienced the lowest of the low as an author that you can experience. And then
53 cents was a good start for the low.
It was something. It was definitely less than $1. And then a couple years passed, and I noticed that there had been these books written on the great companies of Silicon Valley. Google and. There were Facebook books, and there was a whole genre of Apple books, and no one had written the great Amazon book. And this was now 2011, 2012, when Amazon was beginning to take off after really a decade of being completely underestimated as just an online retailer. And that's how I started on my research on the Amazon book, and it really coincided with this maturation or emergence of Amazon, not just as an online retailer, but it was really one of the foundational technology companies of our age.
So when you came here last time, you gave a lesson to everyone on how to pronounce Bezos. It's not Bezos, it's Bezos.
Bezos, yeah.
So before we dive into Uber, how do you pronounce Travis's last name?
Travis Kalanick.
Kalanick.
Yes.
Okay, not Kalkanick, because I hear some people.
No, that would be wrong.
Kalanick.
Yeah,
Okay,
Kalanick.
great.
No, Kalanick.
Okay, so speaking of
and by
Mr.
the way, even I
or
did
not.
I spent months saying Bezos, and people still get it wrong. And
It's Bezos.
yeah, Bezos.
And it's Kalanick.
No, Kalanick.
Kalanick.
Yeah, it's hard to get.
And it's Chesky.
Chesky, yes.
Chesky.
Brian Chesky of Airbnb.
Okay, difficult. Shouldn't be that hard.
Shouldn't be, but some people have names that are hard to pronounce.
All right, so speaking of Travis, we booked this back in January. When did the book actually come out?
At
What
the end
date?
of January.
End of January. Okay, so we talked about doing the speaker series back in January, prior to a lot of the recent Uber scandals. So we can't get started without asking you a little bit about your perspective on their latest scandals. I believe everyone in this room is up to speed on them. Yeah?
Well, they're hard.
Okay.
It's actually hard to keep track right now because there have been so many things to unfold over the past couple of weeks. But it's not
With Uber alone.
with Uber alone.
And then you got Pepsi and you got United.
Oh, United, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I know, and of course the White House. But I mean, yesterday
about that.
itself is amazing. But it's not a surprise. It's not really a surprise. And in the book, they had a very difficult 2014 where they had a number of things, that went wrong internally. And I think these have all hit with much greater visibility, in part because Uber itself is now a juggernaut. But I mean, the reasons are the same. This is a company that grew very large, 11, 12,000 employees in a very short amount of time, which had a sort of ruthless orientation, and we can get into this, but I think like the market kind of demanded it. And then, was run by a CEO. Companies take on the personality of their founders and CEOs. A CEO who sort of easily kind of mixed personal and professional because he's devoted so much to this company, who grew in a way that many technology companies have grown with like an emphasis on growth and not a lot of a cause or attention paid to things like the professional guardrails of a human resources organization. And that orientation allowed them to make a lot of these serious mistakes.
In the process of writing the book, Travis ended up participating in the book, right?
Both
What was the process like trying to get him to agree to be a participant in your book?
Yeah, I did the same thing with this book that I did with the Amazon book, which is I tried to create this sort of air of inevitability. Like, this book is happening, and it will be better if you guys participate. And so I brought that to Travis. It was not blackmail, but
No. It doesn't sound like that at all.
No, it's not. But it's legitimately true. This is a controversial topic and company, and it will, the book will be better if you guys share your perspective. And so I went to dinner with Travis, I think in 2014, and he said, quote, "There's no fucking way I'm participating in an Uber book right now." And
Where were you at dinner? I just want a visual.
it was it's in the book. It was in a hotel restaurant, and we were with David Plouffe, who was sort of like laughing silently at my journalistic suicide mission. And he is a former Obama chief of staff, and for a time was the head of comms at Uber. But I had been through that routine with Amazon, which wasn't naturally inclined to cooperate on a book about their company. And the kind of blueprint is, you do it and you get down the road with the project and you talk to as many people as you can, former employees, drivers, riders, regulators, competitors, and eventually kind of common sense and reason wins out and they want to participate. I worked with Amazon. And by the way, Airbnb invited me in right away. I had a great talk with Brian Chesky, and he said, sure, we'd love to do this. And I ended up traveling with him quite a bit. So, it shows a little bit of the different cultures of the two companies. And then eventually a PR executive at Uber convinced Travis that they should cooperate. Right. And over the last year before the book came out, I talked to him a couple of times, a bunch of his senior executives, investors, people from all along the history of the company.
What has he said to you since the book has come out?
Nothing. I've heard good things, but he has been fairly consumed with.
He's a bit busy.
Yeah, he's busy, and he hasn't really said much to anyone about any of this, except for the very scripted public statements. Which I think, look, at this point, if you're Uber, you find the nearest sword and you hurl yourself upon it, because there's nothing you could say. It doesn't, these are things, and by the way, these are mostly things from the stages of the company's history where I write about, where they were adding thousands of employees a year, where Travis, this sounds like a great thing. He loved to bring his employees out to kind of vacations, what he called workations. They went to Miami, they went to Tahoe, they went to Vegas. Right. He put everyone up in hotels. They had pool parties. That Beyonce performed. Now, there were seminars and sprinkled throughout, and they did public service, and but by and large, they were celebrating the company's massive success. And why not? They've got the tiger by the tail. They have spread to 500 cities in a short number of years. They've revolutionized transportation. They're all rich. There's a lot of things to celebrate. But it turns out when you're running a professional company that's very much in the limelight, where you will one day go public, throwing a pool party at midnight with alcohol doesn't foster always the greatest professional behavior. And and I think this is, but this is not unique to Silicon Valley or to Uber, right? Certainly back in Newsweek in the day, there was certain, let's say back in the media business back in the day, or in Hollywood, there is obviously misbehavior, and this is why you have human resources organizations. And Uber made
Is there any HR people here?
Uber made a great hire from Google to run their HR business in 2015. I think it's a lot of the misbehavior, which is egregious, happened earlier in the company's history.
So beside for not having the HR function and then Travis being known as someone relatively ruthless, what else contributed to the culture that we've recently been made aware of?
Well, there's a lot of different things here, and we need to separate them. But there is an element in this litany of conflicts where Jeff Jones, the marketing exec, quit and said he kind of didn't agree with the way that Uber was run, or the grayballing report in the New York Times that that revealed that the company deliberately wasn't picking up regulators, was using technology to monitor regulators and going out of their way to avoid them. And this is really the story I tell in the book. This is why Uber had, in some ways, to operate in this way. And it's all about the market that they entered. A taxi industry that was a century old, that had these very codified categories. You could be a yellow cab and pick up people that were hailing you on the street. You could be a limo or a black car, and somebody had to phone you. And Uber came in with this idea of a digital hail. And by the way, it wasn't the first to do it. There were other companies that tread a little bit more lightly, that tried to play by the rules, and that went nowhere. And I tell those stories in the book in a chapter called The Non-Starters. And it's instructive because it showed what happened when you tried to play by the rules. So Uber comes in with this thing called a digital hail, and it was not illegal. It just really kind of broke the regulatory framework that had existed for a long time. And by the way, taxi drivers never wanted competition. If you lived in San Francisco for a long time, you kind of knew that. The industry was sort of broken. Whenever you introduced competition or tried to grow the number of cars, they would protest, not just here, but everywhere, particularly in Europe. They blocked streets and honked their horns and get angry about it. And Uber comes in with this disruptive notion that breaks the regulatory framework, and they kind of just don't ask for permission, right? They don't even really beg for forgiveness. They just go. And and that was the orientation of the company. It's what made it successful. And what happened was when the regulators would fight back, Uber would basically kind of canvass its customers, who, by the way, loved the company, right? This was introducing a transportation option that did not exist, and customers would come out and email council members or tweet on Uber's behalf, and Uber would basically change the law, and instead of an ambiguity, they would become legal. And so you can just see, this is in the DNA of the company to be kind of disruptors and aggressive and rule breakers, and it then leads to all these activities. If you've got a regulator enthralled to this taxi industry that does not want to change, and they're out there trying to ticket your drivers, not shut you down by a change of the rules, but basically make life difficult for your drivers, what's the response? Well, a rational response might be to try to not service those regulators before you can fight your political battles and win them. And of course, it turns out now through the lens of history, with Uber as a $70 billion company, that kind of behavior looks really bad.
So part of their success is in part because of that ruthlessness a little bit.
Yeah, I feel like every technology company, maybe every initiative needs an equal measure of idealism and ruthlessness. You want to have these bold visions for what you're doing. They empower and energize and motivate employees. They're a kind of North Star for your company. But in these businesses that are, have like these incumbent industries, you also need some ruthlessness to go and avoid, the obstacles and come up with creative solutions.
One of the things I found super interesting, we'll talk about Airbnb in a second, is that a lot of investors passed on Uber in the early days. What were some of the reasons they gave for passing?
I kind of love this part because we lionize the investors of Silicon Valley as the soothsayers, who are so smart and can bet on the future and
see around corners.
And both Uber and Airbnb, they basically all passed, with a very few exceptions. They thought they were bad ideas, and if we're talking about Uber, a number of reasons. One, some of them correctly predicted that it would be a fight in every city. Ron Conway, who is a well-known angel investor who basically invests in everything. Basically, he sent an email saying this will be a fight in every city, and he passed. Others knew Travis's history from some previous companies. He had an enterprise software company called Red Swoosh, and then he was in the peer-to-peer file sharing industry around the time of Napster. He had a business called Scour, and he had a reputation for being a difficult person.
Even back then.
And then also, the founders of the company at first, Garrett Camp, Travis's friend, and Travis, weren't originally going to be part of the business. And to other investors, that was a red flag. And so there's a stat in the book that 150 of the 165 investors who received the angel list email touting a company called UberCab didn't even respond. And in fact, Naval, who runs the angel list service, said that one person actually unsubscribed from AngelList based on getting a deal as ridiculous as Uber. And so, it was a minority of people that saw this as a big opportunity. And really, a lot of credit goes to Bill Gurley at Benchmark, who it's an example of what good venture capitaling looks like. He was trying to find Uber before Uber. He was an investor in OpenTable, Shannon's previous company. I don't know how I made that mistake. And so he was looking for an OpenTable for transportation. And he saw some of these predecessor companies that were playing by the rules and ended up not making an investment. And then Uber was really embodied everything that he was looking for.
So speaking of Airbnb and ability to see around corners, my team knows the story, but in 2009, late 2009, I had coffee with Brian Chesky over at the W Hotel. And he was trying to pitch me on the idea of coming to work there. And I was like, oh, I don't think so, but here's a bunch of other people that I can introduce you to. And I left the W, walked out of the door, and was like, what a stupid idea. So clearly someone who can't see around corners, right here, sitting right here. So when you look at kind of the differences between an Uber and an Airbnb, how would you distill those down in a couple of sentences, beside founder kind of sensibilities?
Well, there's certainly different cultures, but in some ways, similar businesses, and it's why I paired them together. I mean, at a very fundamental level, I'll start with the similarities.
Okay.
They're using the internet to disrupt the movement of goods or people, the movement of people in the real world, right? And we hadn't really seen that before. And these are really regulation encrusted industries, transportation and travel accommodations. They're using marketplace dynamics, really which originated at eBay.
Which is why Brian and I were talking.
Right.
Because of the eBay similarities.
Right. Pierre Omidyar, kind of, lots of things that underlie both of these companies, primarily the smartphone wave. But, the marketplace dynamics, rating, the buyer rating the seller and vice versa, it wouldn't be possible because you're trying to establish trust between strangers and trust in the physical world. Like, these companies are allowing us to do something our mothers told us never to do, right? Get into a stranger's car or walk into a stranger's home, right? Like literally, we
and
were-
sleep there.
Yeah, we were. That was like the only thing we were taught growing up. Do not do what these companies are asking us to do. How are they different? I mean, I think the industries are fundamentally different. Airbnb has come close to establishing a global network effect, because it's based on travel, and so it wasn't easy, but they were able to establish a beachhead in Europe when they really put their minds to it, because Americans want to travel to Europe and vice versa. And so they could extend their original dominance in the US into other markets. Of course, they've had some struggles in China, but by and large, they have access to a global network effect. Uber is very much a local network effect, so they have had to recreate that everywhere they go. And that's why we've seen in some places some very entrenched local competition like Ola in India, Grab in Singapore, Didi in China. I would say that's the biggest kind of business difference, and then of course there's a cultural one as well.
What did you learn about the Airbnb culture?
Okay, well, it's not as different as one might think, and if anything, what I wanted people to come away with at the book, or at least what I concluded, and people can come up with their own conclusion, is that Uber isn't as sort of viciously ruthless as people might think, and the halo over Airbnb's head doesn't gleam as bright as it might want others to think. First of all, I love the Airbnb culture. They have created a real kind of community at Airbnb. They have embraced their hosts, certainly in a way that Uber has not until now tried to embrace their drivers. And of course, there were business reasons to do that. We haven't seen the kind of scandal emerge from Airbnb that we've seen from Uber, so they have scaled a lot more gracefully. But in terms of the business, I talked about how Uber entered an ambiguous regulatory situation in a lot of cities that it entered. Airbnb was similar in some places, but in other places it was illegal. Like in New York had a law on the books saying you could not rent your home.
In some places it still is, right?
Yeah, for less. Well, right. That fight has now played out. But in New York City, for example, you couldn't rent your home for less than 30 days. And that was because there had been all sorts of unsavory, illegal hoteliers that had abused travelers for many years. Wasn't a law that really wasn't a law about Airbnb, but Airbnb was subject to it. But they believed, they had principle that they shouldn't be, that they were allowing a behavior that was good for the world. And so they just launched anyway, and they grew quietly, and they did not inform their guests or hosts that they would be opening themselves up to legal problems or the threat of eviction from their landlords. And there were hosts that paid a pretty significant price. I tell the story in the book of a host who had significant legal problems. There were obviously many people got evicted for illegally using Airbnb. But look, I mean, the company grew to a certain size and became a political presence and started to contend in the same way that Uber did with some of the factions that were trying to limit the use of Airbnb. And so I guess what I'm saying is, this is a business, and it was run.
Big business.
Yeah, it's a big business now, a plus $30 billion valuation, and it was run almost every bit as aggressively as Uber was. It was done again more gracefully, and they did manage the sort of impression around that in a much better way. They call it the regulatory brand, and they say, if you talk to us, you're going to like us, and we want to be in the room for you. But they did the same thing that Amazon did. Amazon grew all across the country without paying sales tax in most places. It should have collected sales tax. It pointed to a Supreme Court ruling that said if we don't have an operation in this state, we're not going to collect. And in a lot of states, it did have an operation, but it called it something else. It isolated it as a corporate entity and said, well, that's not Amazon. That's XYZ LLC, and it evaded sales tax collection efforts until it got big enough that it entered into negotiation with states during the Great Recession when there was facing increasing pressure, and it worked out those agreements. And Airbnb followed the same blueprint. And today it collects taxes in 275 or so states or countries, and it's negotiated those outcomes, but it didn't really do it until it had to. And so I guess the point is, we should celebrate these companies, but again, idealism and ruthlessness, Airbnb, like Uber, has both in spades.
And do you think that the two companies will either one of them be ever as big as Amazon? Like, do they have as much runway?
I mean, personally, I don't think I think Amazon is on track to be one of, if not the largest companies of our time. And that's perhaps a separate discussion, but I'm bullish on Amazon because, it's a founder-led company with, this long-term orientation, a shareholder base that allows it to make these investments over the long term, and seems to have a culture that does spawn innovation at scale, which is remarkable. Yeah. It's a $300 billion company right now, and yet they like the Echo is a great example of really something built from the ashes of failure, right? I mean, they had failed with the phone, the tablet hadn't done that well, and they come out and they come out with this cylindrical, artificially intelligent device that like my kids talk to every single day. So I'm impressed with Amazon. I think Uber and Airbnb are on their way, to building what will one day be independent public businesses. And then there are kind of factors, I think, that will govern how big each of them could be, and we could talk about that.
A lot of these companies get bucketed as the sharing economy. You don't love the term sharing economy.
Yeah, because
you
what
only
are we
use it one
sharing?
time in the book.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that.
Well, so Airbnb, so certainly there are, cute elderly couples who are sharing the spare room to make their retirement work. And Airbnb celebrates those people, and you know them because you see them in the ads. But there are obviously commercial operators and people that are, have a property in a beach town somewhere, and they're using Airbnb as a sort of income generating property. And so I don't necessarily think that's sharing. Or an Uber driver who is leasing a car and now driving it basically as a taxi driver. It's not really sharing the seats in that car. And so it's a bit of a misnomer. I like the trust economy because both these companies are, as we talked about, establishing trust among strangers. But really, that's a little awkward as well. Perhaps, the upstarts. We could just call them the upstarts, or even just
that's random.
Uber and Airbnb. Yeah, and Lyft, of course, is in there, and Didi, and all these.
I was going to ask you if you actually think Lyft has any chance to.
Oh yeah.
There's room for two players, right?
There definitely is.
Do they have any chance to eat into Uber's market share in any specific place, or do you just think in general there'll always be room for two players?
Well, I mean, if you look at the way that the taxi market developed in most cities, there were always more than one. There was always more than one player, and the extraordinary thing that Lyft has done, and Uber has unwittingly assisted in it, is like Lyft has established a kinder, gentler brand. And if you just look around the city of San Francisco, particularly over the last few months, I would say Lyft is ascendant right now.
Yeah.
Because people have had a visceral reaction to the scandals of Uber.
They just raised another round too.
And they raised another round. And part of I think Lyft's enduring success is the capital environment that we are still in. A couple of years ago, us in the media were all ringing the bell about another collapse in the internet economy, and whether we were in a bubble or not. And I think, obviously there have been some fatalities, but by and large, people still want to invest in Silicon Valley. They still see opportunity in this new wave of tech companies. And so companies like Lyft and Didi and Ola, even if the economics aren't yet where they need to be, and probably, I don't think any of these companies are profitable, they can still raise money. So the question is, if they ever do have to really instill some discipline and get to profitability, who looks the best in that situation? Lyft is now big. These things work better at scale, and I think Lyft is getting to the scale where it can be an enduring number two.
So, I mean, LinkedIn is a very successful two-sided marketplace. OpenTable certainly was. eBay was ahead of its time. No one, actually, when I was out shopping the concept of a two-sided marketplace, people were like, I don't know what that is. When you look at where eBay kind of ceilinged a bit, where you look at Lyft and Uber and Airbnb is really taking off, where did eBay stumble that these guys can try to avoid?
Oh, this is a great question. And actually, I'll try to answer it, and then maybe I will ask you to answer it as well, because if you want to.
This isn't what we agreed to.
But, I think like every two-sided marketplace has to make a bet on what side of the marketplace they're going to emphasize. And for Airbnb, the founder started as hosts. They really did emphasize hosts. They have a host event every year, and it's like the emphasis is how you get the flywheel spinning. Uber is definitely a rider-focused organization. They relentlessly lower prices to try to increase demand, push competitors out of business, threaten car ownership. That's the orientation of Uber. I think eBay was probably a buyer-focused company to begin with as well. And the problem with making a bet, which you have to do early on if you're a two-sided marketplace, is eventually you need to start paying attention to the other side, or they start to get a little bit unruly. They start to get a little bit unhappy. And we've seen it with Uber drivers. In fact, you probably notice it every time you get into the back of an Uber car, or maybe half the time, and the driver's just pissed off because his pay is down, he's driving all the time, maybe he's sleeping in the Safeway parking lot so he can start driving early the next day. He doesn't like his car lease, he's in over his head, he feels—
He tells you all of this in the car?
Well, of course, they all love to talk. And in fact, you saw so I work at Bloomberg, and we published a video, one of the scandals of Travis, fighting with the driver, which was a terrible moment for him and an undisciplined moment for any CEO, and a mistake any way you look at it. But there was obviously some frustration there that here he is facing kind of this pent up and very typical frustration of drivers. That look, I mean, we can go into the details of his argument, but it's sort of, Travis could have had a more reasoned argument with him. But I think, where eBay foundered was it didn't start paying attention enough to the mechanics and the unhappiness of its sellers. And I think Uber probably last year realized it had to start getting more serious about drivers. It's why they hired Jeff Jones from Target. He recently quit. The video came out. It's been a huge setback. They still have not really gotten or been able to address the unhappiness. I think Airbnb has done a much better job of managing the demands and the needs of both sides of its marketplace.
We're going to open it up for questions in 5 minutes. Sorry.
Do you want to weigh in on that?
Sorry, what was it?
Well,
okay.
Is Uber making the mistakes that you saw eBay make?
So we over-optimized 100% on the buyers for a long time, and then when we decided to pay attention to the sellers, it was almost too late, and then they didn't like the changes that we made. And so right at the same time, Amazon's third-party marketplace came into play too, and then all of a sudden, it was just all a little bit too late. We also had a bit of a trust problem too. Trust and safety back then. Imagine this, I used to work on the eBay Motor side, and so we would have to go to reporters and try to tell people, no, people will buy a car online. Like, what? No one could believe it. You were basically selling this idea that, you were not gonna get a lemon, we promise. So we were trying to create the concept at the same time, but trust back then was, I don't get it. This whole idea of a trust economy, this was 2000, by the way, so this is a long time ago. And I think that there were enough people that felt like they were not, they did not have a good experience. It ended up eroding the overall company in that way.
And I think there's a corollary with Uber and Airbnb. They do not really control or own any of these assets. They cannot ensure great driver behavior or great host behavior.
Yeah.
I mean, they can do a lot of things to make good if something goes wrong or to kick bad actors out of the system. But yeah, it's a problem for any internet marketplace when you're not a hotel, you're not a taxi company, you're not United. You can't, even though they don't do a great job of ensuring that there's a high quality experience.
I was thinking that yesterday, the only person necessarily not happy, but at least pleased that the United thing is happening is Uber, because no one's talking about Uber right now, except us, of course, but everyone's talking about United. Fascinating example. Okay, we're gonna open it up in 3 minutes, so I'm gonna ask you one more question. Does everyone who has a question wanna go to the mic? So someone wanted me to ask you, these were preceded. So based on all your interviews and conversations around the growth of both of these companies specifically, what would you recommend to upcoming startups and their CEOs?
Well, like as a course of action?
Yeah, or just in general as they grow. Course of action for scaling.
Well, I mean, I think,
Hire an HR team.
Yeah, I was about to say, it did occur to me that there was probably not enough awareness at okay, let me phrase this as a lesson of like kind of envision your success. What will the tactics that you have to engage in when you're a small, scrappy startup, how will they look when somebody comes knocking at your door to write the book, or when it is considered in the history of your achievements in the bank account of corners cut and and people trampled on the way to success, and these things have a way of emerging, and when you're kind of pursuing glory at all costs, bad behavior can emerge. And I think like the problems at Uber are a great example of how kind of culture is set from the top. The values that you instill at a company very early on are so important, not just for hiring and for promoting, but for encouraging a kind of set of behavior and diffusing it through the organization. So I think it's not a coincidence that Airbnb establishes its corporate values very early on. I think it's 2012. They have a retreat at like the Ames estate in the wine country at an offsite, and they think about what are the values, what are the principles that we want to...
No pool parties.
Yeah, infuse in the organization. I don't know if that was one, but it's a good idea. And Uber comes to this very late. They do their corporate values in 2015. And they really kind of just duplicate Amazon's. If you look, there's 14 Amazon leadership values. They're interesting. You can see them on the Amazon website. There are 14 Uber values. Some of them are very similar, and not a coincidence. Both of these companies really admire Amazon and Jeff Bezos. But I think these values are instilled late. One of them is what we're just talking about, driver obsession. And you can say
that's
something.
The Amazon customer obsession, right?
Probably it's a corollary. You can say something like that, but for the first 5 years, Uber didn't really live that, or really necessarily even have it or believe in it. And so you bring in the value a little late, and maybe the company either rejects it or doesn't organically embrace it. And so I think that's maybe another lesson. Figure out very early on, the values that you want to use to run the company.
I feel like we've done that actually very well. There's an anecdote in the book that I would love for you to share for the people that haven't read it, where you mentioned Bill Gurley, where Travis is actually trying to get the deal signed with Benchmark, and they pulled a bit of a prank. Do you want to tell people a little bit about that? It's actually a funny one.
Yeah, so I don't know why they thought this was funny,
it's
but
also instructive.
Uber had just launched in San Francisco, so it did not exist down on the peninsula. And Benchmark had invited Travis to come talk to the partners. I think it was the Series A, and he had a bunch of meetings on Sand Hill Road, and he was taking an Uber obviously from San Francisco. And he went to Sequoia first, and the Uber partners could see that he was at Sequoia because there was only one Uber that was idling outside of Sequoia's offices. And so they called that driver over to Benchmark, and then they sent him away. And so Travis didn't have a ride from Sequoia to Benchmark, and he ended up having to run like 3/4 of a mile to Benchmark's office. And he showed up all sweaty and huffing and puffing. And then later they sent him like a pair of sneakers to acknowledge and celebrate the prank.
Is that what sealed the deal?
I don't think that sealed it. I think the valuation probably sealed the deal.
The $70 billion valuation? Okay, we're going to open it up for questions. Anyone from the stream or in San Francisco, if you want to get started, that'd be great. Questions for Brad? Yeah, please.
Hi, Brad. Oh, if everyone can hear me. My name's Andy. I'm in sales for our learning solutions business here. One of my roommates is a software engineer at Uber, and he just started. He's 23 years old, and when they IPO, he'll have like a 6-figure bonus check waiting for him. The problem is that
he probably won't be your roommate after that, by the way. I'm trying to point that out.
Yeah, probably not. But what he says is that there's a lot of chatter about how a lot of the software engineering talent, something that we prioritize here, would be interested in leaving after they collect that check. So I guess my question for you is, what do you make of the impending IPO and sort of talent versus brand and profit? And
yeah, I mean, thank you, Andy. It's a great question, and one that every technology startup has to face. It's one of the reasons, I think, why Travis has perpetually postponed an IPO to kind of postpone that day of reckoning when he'll have to continue to motivate some of these employees that, maybe are entrepreneurial, maybe they don't like working at a big company, find a smaller opportunity, find their small thing. It's one of the particular challenges of having a business in the Bay Area right now. There's just so much competition. One of the ways that you inspire people and you get them to stick around is with the idealism, the goal, the mission of the company. You might lose the mercenaries, but you keep the missionaries. And so I think his role to keep your roommate and other people is to inspire them and to figure, and to have them believe that they are changing transportation for the better. And look, I believe that. It's easy to be cynical about Uber until you go to places like the south side of Chicago or Cleveland, Ohio, where I'm from, like transportation deserts, where really, there's the public bus system, but you can't call a taxi. And maybe like the subway system is only serves some communities, and Uber has not only served those people, but it's created a lot of economic opportunity for people between jobs or out of jobs or in college. And so I think Uber needs to amplify that message, make that argument a little more strongly on its own behalf, and then you can end up inspiring and keeping employees.
I recently sat down with John Zimmer at Lyft, and he has a really interesting story about what Lyft is trying to do to change. He's not talking about changing transportation, he's talking about changing cities and eliminating traffic. And he has a lot of benefits he talks about with regard to Lyft, and that's the thing I don't hear as much from Ubers. I don't think they've actually said this is what we're trying to do on behalf of the world. It's more, hey, we're trying to change transportation and be disruptive, but there's less about what it's actually doing for society, and I think Lyft has done a really good job at that. At least John's mind is that way. I don't know that they've exactly rolled it out that way, but there's a stark contrast there between the two in my mind.
I agree, and sometimes when you do hear that vision, that idealism from Travis, it sometimes seems borrowed from Lyft. That they have
lifted from Lyft?
Yeah, hey, very much better. They have co-opted the idea of eliminating traffic or getting people out of cars. I think they probably need to do a little bit better on the idealism front or articulating their mission.
And a mission can't be self-serving, right? I mean, that's sort of the point of a mission statement. Okay, Fanote.
I actually heard your podcast with Kara on the subject, and great interview, though not as much fun. I would like to ask you a little bit about what you think self-driving cars will actually do to this ecosystem, and given that Google has such a head start in that arena, but obviously Uber is investing in it, how do you see that changing the game down the line?
Yeah, great question. It completely changes the game. I mean, it's almost a reset for the transportation industry. I mean, it might still be 10 or 15 years off, but just the notion of not only taking the taxi driver out of the car, but perhaps getting to a point where none of us need to even own cars anymore because there's a sort of persistent fleet of self-driving cars going around, picking people up, dropping people off. It has so many implications for not only all of these companies and industries like the auto industry, but the way we organize our neighborhoods and the amount of space that we devote to parking lots. The competition right now between Uber and Google and Tesla and all the automakers Udacity is incredibly interesting. Primarily, in large part, because Uber and Google are now fighting, as we tend to do in Silicon Valley, over intellectual property, and there's a chance, the way this case is going, that Uber is in real trouble because they hired a former Google executive who was then accused of taking along some of the intellectual property. And if Uber is kind of stymied in its efforts to continue down this path, it's an existential problem for the company. If it doesn't own or at least lead the charge into self-driving cars, we could possibly see the valuation go down to almost nothing. That's over the course of many, many years, but I think it's something that really would weigh on an IPO. And so it's incredibly important for all these companies, but particularly for Uber to be able to demonstrate that it is taking a leadership position in self-driving cars.
What year do you think the IPO will come?
I really have no idea, but I think he wanted to postpone it as long as possible for the reasons we discussed. And I think all of these scandals have probably created actually some pressure to do it sooner rather than later to invite and embrace the transparency and maturation and professionalization that comes from being a public company. So if I was guessing, I'd say 2018.
2018, next year, okay.
Hi, Brad. My name is Jeremiah Clark. My question for you is, in a two-sided economy, what signals or what quantity of signals do companies need to receive in order to determine their trigger into shifting their optimization? Furthermore, as a journalist, likewise, in a two-sided political party country like the US, what signals should leaders look at in order to determine how to optimize for each group?
Thank you, Jeremiah. I mean, I think the first part of the question, like, listen to the community, and it becomes fairly obvious. Like, it probably should have been obvious, maybe it was, to eBay, before they became more seller-focused, that they had a problem. Like, the internet allows and empowers people to air their grievances, maybe to a fault. But there's no kind of lack of signal, and maybe there's a preponderance of signal. Maybe that's the problem. That it kind of tends to empower the squeakiest wheels in every community, and you tend, a company maybe is inclined to think of the complaints as being, as coming from the malcontents, the extreme, and there's a tendency inside the company to kind of villainize those people that tend to complain. You've probably seen it, and but at a certain point, those individual complaints, kind of turn into a chorus of malcontent with how the marketplace is being operated. So I just think you need to listen very closely and to find out when it is more of a kind of collective grievance.
And there's like an open table, it doesn't matter as much, right? You have to optimize for the restaurants. There's not that much that diners can complain about. It's not a crisis situation. It's not transportation. It's not something very small. I'm trying to get a restaurant reservation. So that was not a group that we spent a lot of time with. It's really easy to interact with the restaurant.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point, because when you get to a certain size or strength of one of these marketplace businesses, you approach monopoly. And when you're a monopoly or close to it, it kind of doesn't matter if people are unhappy because they have fewer options, or it might not seem like it matters as much. But I would probably say that it's just good business to make sure both sides of the marketplace ultimately are happy. The political question, I'm going to have a hard time answering. Particularly, it just feels like the current situation is so muddied, and I would be on very thin ice if I started weighing in on the current climate.
Patrick.
This is Kostya. Thanks for the wonderful presentation and for coming over. Going back to the driverless cars, what do you think, how do you or Travis think about pricing, right? I mean, not having a driver opens up a freedom of attention, and attention is not free. So do you think there's gonna be like free rides if you get bombarded with the ads, or what's the price premium to be ad-free ride? How do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you, Patrick.
These are hard questions.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah,
Geez.
these are smart group of people.
There's probably no way to know right now. I mean, obviously, if it's Google, right, that's Google's orientation as a business to be ad-supported, to monetize attention. And you could see that. Maybe one day, far in the future, it's free, but there's a litany of entertainment options in the backseat that you pay for, or productivity options. I mean, hopefully it's not go-go wireless in our driverless cars. That would be horrible. Like $19 for this 30-minute ride. Yeah. No, go-go is not just United. It's horrible throughout.
No, I know, but poor United. Not poor United.
And so, but I think probably where it starts, it'll start as a premium option, right? These cars will be expensive, and who knows if we'll even have fleets of them. Maybe they'll start as like actually it is starting right now as an option on cars that you buy, premium cars that you buy. Tesla comes with an auto drive feature, and so as with all things, maybe starts at the high end and goes down, and we'll see if it ever gets to free. But it does seem like the thinking has coalesced around a kind of Uber-like model where you have operators that are actually buying large fleets of self-driving cars and then going and using them as rideshare networks, and where the price, because there isn't a driver, is somewhat lower than the rates we pay today.
In the middle of Uber's no good, terrible, very bad week, there was also a crash with one of their self-driving cars in Phoenix that didn't get much attention because everyone was focused
but it
on
wasn't
some of the other
Uber.
stuff.
It wasn't the Uber car's fault in that one.
Oh.
It was a driver that blew through a red light, and
So
actually, it might have been the
didn't
Uber
get out.
car that went through an orange light, and the other car hit it. It did come out. Bloomberg, we wrote a very nice story about
sorry,
that. But,
I missed it.
And you know, you're busy.
I was reading
You're a busy
Newsweek
person.
back
The Uber car ended up on its side, and Uber for a day suspended its driverless car testing to investigate it, and then it started it after a day. And I mean, the problem with all this is that you know, as great as the self-driving cars may be, you know, there are humans will be in the equation, you know, somewhere, and you know, humans, it turns out, are bad drivers, and in some cases very distracted, and so, you know, the safety benefits promised to us have not yet, and may not materialize for a while.
Nicole.
Yes, thank you. So as somebody who was not born in 1993, before that, works
Way before.
so much gray hair. Working in Web 1.0 and seeing some of the companies that failed then be successful in 2.0, which is some of the model that you're talking about here, and your comment about looking around corners, curious of if you see anything that isn't working in our Web 2.0 that you think will need to wait until 3.0. So more at the future, especially as somebody who doesn't have a horse in the race.
Right, and you know, if I could really predict that, I might be in a different business. There are more profitable ways to earn a living than writing books, I should say. That may be surprising. But you know, I think like virtual reality is a great example of something that has long been promised to us, that is interesting now, that is maybe kind of overvalued right now, but it's clearly, you know, not a mainstream product yet. But you know, I think eventually, like when Shannon and I are in the old folks' home, you know, I look forward to one day, you know, despite almost certainly being incapacitated, putting on a virtual reality headset and being able to visit anywhere in the world. You know, that's a great vision, and it's just definitely not here yet. Driverless cars, and even these artificial intelligence systems like Alexa or Google Home or Siri. They're interesting. They're kind of novelties. It's fun to play with them, but you know, they're not great. They're far from perfect. You know, it's like some real buffoonery trying to engage them in conversation. But you can see at a point in a couple of years, you know, they're going to get much better. And then the implications are staggering. You know, not just for how we spend our time, but for the disruption and dislocation of jobs. You know, because these you know, systems will become much more powerful.
What do you think about door delivery? Because like to Nicole's point on Web 1.0, like Webvan was known as like the dot bomb, right? And now Instacart actually seems to be having some success. You think that's a place where the world will contract a bit?
Definitely. I mean, I think all these businesses, they work at scale. It's really hard to see how the economics work now. They continue to raise money because, as we talked about, the capital climate, you know, the capital is still available. There are all sorts of mutual funds and sovereign wealth funds that want to invest in Silicon Valley. You know, but there will be consolidation, and it seems to me that'll be the players like Amazon and Uber that have these, you know, pre-existing fleets that blanket cities that don't necessarily need to make these services profitable because they've got other kind of profit engines that will end up dominating the business.
There's so many verticalizations too. I just saw the launch of an organic baby food to your door company. Like that's about as niche as you can possibly get. So at some point you imagine Amazon's going to get wise to this. And
yeah.
Question from the stream?
Yes, from the stream. Do you see any major fintech lender, like SoFi or Lending Club, having the disruptive success of Uber, Airbnb, or is the consumer loan space too risky and unstable?
That's someone who's interviewing at one of those companies and wants to know from Brad if they should go work there.
This was for a
So obviously the answer is no.
I'm going to just sorely disappoint that questioner because I don't know enough about it. Lending Club has had problems, regulatory problems in the past, public relations problems. I don't really know if they've
Business problems that public relations had to deal with.
Yeah. Okay. And I don't. and SoFi, you know, seems interesting. Seems like a good idea, but I really don't know enough about it.
Okay. Last question.
Hi. You have done some great research on Amazon, Airbnb, and Uber and their business models. So what do you think are like some mistakes which can wipe out present-day companies out of business?
Like these particular companies?
Yeah, these particular companies, the new Silicon Valley companies.
Well, okay, so we talked about self-driving cars for Uber. I would say for Airbnb, it's this regulatory push and pull that they're still engaged with cities that want to limit the number of nights that hosts can provide. It's not existential for Airbnb, but when you cap supply, it's always a problem for a marketplace. So they need to go and continue to leverage their political might and their customer base to go and and fight for every last night in every city that they can to continue to grow their host community. They also have this effort to expand into other kinds of activities when somebody is on a trip, tours or travel accommodations.
That seems to be their new post-vacation.
Yeah, it's the Trips platform, and that will really govern partly how big a company Airbnb will eventually be. And then I think with Amazon, it's very difficult to see any sort of existential threat, but clearly with all founder-led companies, when the founder does move on to something else, if and when that happens with Jeff at Amazon, just like Tim Cook at Apple, or Steve Ballmer at Microsoft, there will be a transition underway at Amazon at some point, maybe decades into the future. And then at that point, investors kind of reassess their relationship with the company. Maybe the leash is a little bit shorter. Maybe Amazon doesn't continue to be able to invest in its business like it has. And that'll be interesting. That will be the, what Jeff would maybe refer to as day 2 at Amazon. He's perpetually now in day 1.
So leadership changes, cultural issues, execution issues, and potentially regulatory are the missteps you would advise companies to avoid.
Seems safe.
Because you may come knocking one day trying to write a book. Is that right?
It's a concise summary of some things I may or may not have said in the course of this.
This is live.
This lovely session.
We have a tape. Okay, this was so fun. Thank you
Shannon,
so much.
thank you guys, and thank you guys
Brad,
for taking
thank
some
you.
time today.